Now, for the typist, I would like to have 5 copies, an original and 4 carbons, made of the following notes. These notes are to be titled Insert Notes for Book on the Essence of Love and the Love Relationship. Love is one's most essential self, capital E, capital S, or pure consciousness substance, and is one's unconditioned being, capital B, or consciousness, period. When one's self-acceptance is unconditional, i.e., when I non-judgmentally accept that I am the author of all of my positive and negative experiential states, and accept all those relative opposites with the attitude of, in quotes, this too is me, unquote, then whatever the world arouses in me will be totally acceptable to me. And I can then let it be whatever it has to be, and I will accept it. Therefore, in essence, to love oneself unconditionally, meaning non-judgmentally, is also to love the world unconditionally or non-judgmentally. This is because if I accept myself totally, whatever the world triggers in me will be acceptable to me. Therefore, I am then free to let the world be all that it has to be, which is the essence of what love really means. So it is really only the mature consciousness, yes, yes, it is only the mature consciousness that is truly capable of loving, because it is only the mature consciousness that is fully able to take responsibility for oneself. What that means is to take responsibility for the creation of whatever experiential self we are from moment to moment. In other words, accepting the fact that I am the author of my own feelings and experiences. When I do that, I'm fully capable then of accepting all that I create, and through that full responsibility for myself and full acceptance of myself, I have reached the stage of true self-love, which also enables me to maturely love others, and have gone beyond the immature stage of narcissistic, Narcissistic, narcissistic self-valuing, which is based upon value judgments applied to only parts of my being, such as my intelligence, my attractiveness, my strength, athletic ability, or whatever, whereas love relates to the totality of the individual rather than to the valuing or liking of any particular part of the total's psychological or physical being. Therefore, immature people, in feeling deficient, always seek to value some part of the other. They value that part of the other that they feel will gratify their feelings of deficiency. Whereas real love is not out of feelings of deficiency, but out of a sense of wholeness already, and therefore one unconditionally or non-judgmentally accepts all of the other person because one has already unconditionally and non-judgmentally accepted all of oneself first. Therefore, it is truly not possible to maturely and constructively love another human being until one has been able to love oneself, meaning to unconditionally accept all of oneself, which means accepting the responsibility of being the author of all of one's positive and negative feelings, and therefore rejecting nothing that one has created, but only seeing why one has created those negative feelings, letting them speak for themselves, and then draining out. As soon as one accepts being both positive and negative relative opposites, one then becomes neither, but is the pure consciousness substance that underlies and composes both relative opposite self-concept thought forms. And that pure consciousness substance that underlies all thoughts and experiences is love itself. Thus, to restate essentially the basic fact that love is not a valuing of the other, a judgmental liking to an extreme of the other. Love is not a relationship to only part of the other, but rather in the total acceptance of the other, and in that sense of oneness with the other, there is the release in one's own consciousness of one's own self-concept awareness. And when one is not aware of one's own self-concepts, one is pure consciousness substance, which is the release of love. Therefore, the sacrifice of love is of one's own complete self-awareness and being completely aware of the other. And in that sense, one becomes in a state of oneness or union with the other, which is the love relationship. Now skip a couple of lines, new paragraph, new section. Thus, love is not an emotion or an experience. Both emotion and experience arises out of an ego state of duality, the separation of subject and object, whereas love is a state of communion or non-duality between oneself as the subject and the other as the object. Experience is always of some part of the other and involves valuing. It is always relative. And experience is always a half-truth because it is relative. It is always a reaction to some part of the individual that is conceptualized as positive or negative, such as a person's strength or a person's aggressiveness. Whereas love is not of the left side or the right side, meaning the negative or the positive, but love is of the totality of the individual, which includes both the negative and the positive, but also is beyond both the negative and the positive. So experience is one-sided knowledge, whereas love is two-sided, including both the positive and the negative. Experience is of half-truths only, the conceptual relative positive opposite or the negative relative opposite. Therefore, when we experience one or the other, we have only half knowledge, half awareness, whereas love includes the totality of the individual. Because love and wholeness are the same, love and truth are one and the same. And therefore truth is beyond relativity and love is beyond relativity. And because time and space are concepts of relativity, love and truth are transpersonal aspects rather than personal or egotistical aspects, and therefore also are beyond time and space. Qualities of the other can only be liked a great deal, valued, and valuing and liking is relative. You can value a little or a lot. You can value some part more or less than another part. But love is absolute and transcends liking or valuing. Therefore, anyone who values only the positive aspects of the other, but cannot non-judgmentally or unconditionally accept the negative as well, doesn't really love the other or enter into a love relationship with the other. They may value those positive parts of the other, but it is not a mature and constructive state of love. If you reject the negative in the other, it's because that negative triggers some negative feeling in yourself that you are unable to accept and therefore you reject that in the other as well. As a result, your acceptance of the other person is conditional, meaning that your acceptance is limited to there being only the positive traits that you value, and conditional upon the fact that they never express to you those negative traits that arouse in you negative feelings that you can't accept in yourself. Whereas real love is unconditional acceptance. Unconditional meaning that there is no judgment. It is non-judgmental. There is no judger present. Because there is no feeling of deficiency that requires one to judge whether the other person's traits are of an advantage to you or a disadvantage to you. Therefore, love is unconditional acceptance, non-judgmental approval, and is unconditioned acceptance of the totality of the other. This is in contrast to valuing or liking, which is relative and conditional upon the other person giving you what fills your feelings of ego deficiency. If the other does not meet that condition, then your valuing is removed. Under those circumstances, your valuing of the other is truly not a valuing at all, because it reflects a valuing of yourself, because you value in the other only what makes yourself feel good. And when the other ceases to give you what makes you feel good about yourself, then the other ceases to have value to you. This is a note aside to the typist. I recognize that as I dictate this, that I have not indicated where the periods go, commas and so forth. Please feel free to put them in where they seem reasonable to you. And where repetition of words exists, put them in as long as they make sense. And otherwise, type them in with a note to my attention, so I can reread it and correct it if it requires correction. New paragraph. Because there is no valuing in love, there is greater security in the real love relationship, period. Where valuing exists, then the possibility of ceasing to value that particular trait or finding that trait existing in somebody else in a more valuable condition also is possible. And therefore we are always insecure and frightened that the valuing of the particular trait that we have will someday cease, or that we will lose that particular trait in some quantity or quality, and therefore we will no longer be valued. However, love, because there is no judgment, value judgment, good or bad, of the other individual. Therefore, there is no insecurity, because we know that whatever traits we may have, that even if they change and alter or we lose some of them, that we are not being loved because those particular traits are being valued. In that sense, people mean, in quotes, love is blind. What this means is that in a real love condition, the specific traits of the other are not especially valued or non-valued, but in a sense, the person is able to make contact with all of the traits in the other, both positive and negative, and in that contact and state of union, love is released regardless of whether it is something positive or negative that is being shared or expressed. Thus, some men may value a woman's attractiveness, and when she loses that attractiveness, then the valuing is gone, and therefore the love relationship is terminated. Or some women may value what they feel is strength in men, and then if they show some kind of signs of weakness, then the valuing also is gone, and the love relationship is terminated. Therefore, it is necessary that the reader recognize that one is never really valued. What we are really valuing are those traits in the other that enable us to value ourselves more. So, if someone is strong and protects us, then we value the state of security that that brings. If someone is attractive and values us, then we feel more beautiful ourselves or more masculine, which boosts that ego identity. A new paragraph titled this new section. In the same way that you can only love the totality of the other. Yes. To repeat then, in the same way that you can only love the totality of the other and not value just a part of the other, so too, because life is an infinite, indivisible whole, if you value some part of life and reject other parts of life, then you are truly not loving life. To love life is to relate to it as one relates to any beloved. To love life requires that we unconditionally accept the totality of life, not valuing or judging any of her forms, but unconditionally accepting the totality of whatever life expresses. This is not to say that life does not bring troubles, and pains, and difficulties. But it does mean that all of these have to be accepted unconditionally as a part of life and to be used constructively for our own understanding and growth experience of ourselves, as well as understanding the relative and paradoxical nature of life itself. New paragraph. What has to be understood if one is to really understand the essence of the love relationship, is to understand the concept of ecstasy. The word ecstasy comes from the Greek ex, hyphen, stasis, S-T-A-S-I-S, meaning to stand outside of oneself. What that means essentially is that for ecstasy or love to arise in one's consciousness, one's conscious awareness has to stand outside the awareness of one's own self-concepts. When you, as pure conscious awareness, love something so much that you care about knowing it more than you care about shining the light of conscious awareness upon yourself and knowing yourself, then you are in an ecstatic relationship that is self-transcendent, and your consciousness is then pure consciousness substance, which is one with love. Thus, love requires a sacrifice of conceptual awareness of one's sense of personal individuality in order to put one's conscious awareness completely upon the consciousness of the other individual, so that at that point, when there is no longer any trace of self-conscious awareness, and one is not aware of oneself conceptually or experientially in the slightest at all, because one's conscious awareness is absorbed completely in the other, then the consciousness is free of one's own conceptual self-knowledge, self-consciousness, which releases love or ecstasy as one's natural and most essential experiential reality. This next section deals with love as conceptual ignorance. That is the non-conceptually knowing of the other individual, the non-labeling of the other individual, the non-valuing, the non-desiring of any particular part of the other individual, but the unconditional acceptance of the totality of the other individual. Lovers share a common reality, a mutually shared understanding, which then unites them as one. And in that state of union, love is released. What is essentially being said is that the human being is truly a whole, W-H-O-L-E, and therefore more than any particular labeled part. When we label an individual in terms of his or her parts, then our attempt is to secure the gratification of feelings of deficiency on our part through having those particular parts of the other individual become shared with us. So if I value the other person's strength because I have a feeling of deficiency in strength, that is, I feel weak, helpless, impotent, or vulnerable, then I have labeled that individual as strength or power or protection or security, and relate primarily to that part of the other individual, to the exclusion of the rest of the individual. That, as indicated earlier, reflects valuing arising out of ego deficiency feelings and is not love. Love is an unconditional acceptance of the totality of the other individual, and therefore cannot conceptualize that individual or limit that individual in any way. The same is true when we relate to life as a whole. In order to live ecstatically with life, in order to love life, one cannot conceptually react to and relate to only particular forms of life, valuing some and disvaluing or rejecting others. In the same way that a single individual cannot love himself if he rejects part of himself and values other parts of himself, because then his acceptance of himself is conditional rather than unconditional. For love to exist, we have to accept ourselves as a totality, rather than saying, I like my eyes, but I hate my nose, and the like. In the same way, life being an infinite essence, the totality of life, the indivisible, unitary wholeness of life, has to be unconceptually related to, unconditionally accepted, and only then does one have a true ecstatic or love relationship with life. Thus, love exists only when relativity, that is, value judgments of good versus bad, is transcended, and an absolute state of separation between subject and object, or what's called the state of duality, must also be transcended for one's consciousness to be in union with the other in order for there to be a true love relationship established. It is important to recognize that love, like beauty, does not reside in the object related to, but rather resides in the process itself or manner of relationship between oneself as the object and whatever, rather, of course, between oneself as the subject and whatever it is that one is relating to as the object. And the essence of that relationship, in which a sense of beauty and love arise, is what I have been calling the ecstatic or non-dualistic communion relationship in which the subject is in a state of non-separation from the object, in that one's conscious awareness and attention is being totally invested in the object, so that there is not the slightest trace of self-consciousness. The more common means of subject-object contact may not be called relationship, but merely interaction between subject and object, in which there is a state of duality or psychological separation, distance between the subject and the object, so that one feels absolutely distinct from or separate from the object that one is knowing or experiencing. Under those circumstances, there is never a release of a sense of love or beauty, period. The ironical factor is that most people have been yearning for a sense of beauty and love, because that intrinsically exists within their own consciousness when one is completely absent of self-consciousness. However, one has been seeking that experience of love or beauty in some external object. So that for most of us, we seek beauty in a loved one, or we seek love in the loved one and from the loved one, instead of recognizing that love and beauty is the experiential reality that arises when one's sense of subjectivity is completely transcended. And that sense of subjectivity is completely transcended when one has lost self-consciousness completely, so that one's conscious awareness is completely absorbed in union with the consciousness or form of the other. Self-consciousness, which requires the construction of self-concepts and a state of internal duality, is essentially the opposite of the process of love, and may be called narcissism. Narcissism means essentially, as it is used from the myth of Narcissus, that one is concerned about admiring oneself through an image of oneself. It is the self-concept that serves as the mirror image by which the sense of subjectivity attempts to know itself. The sense of subjectivity pretends that the self-concept is his own true image being reflected back to him. It is ecstatic love, however, that is the undoing and the only undoing of narcissism that is possible. And therefore, love is the transcendence of dualistic self-consciousness and is the transcendence of all self-concept identification, at least for that given moment in which the ecstatic, non-dualistic communion relationship that releases love is established. New paragraph. entitled The Mystery of Love. Although we can experience love non-dualistically rather than out of subject-object knowledge or experience, love is essentially a mystery in that we can never know what it is. In the same way that one cannot know what pure life is, for love and pure life are essentially the same. We can say, basically, that both love and life are related to the pure consciousness substance that we are, that everyone is. But still, that is not saying what love actually is. It cannot be conceptualized. Although we can say many things about love, we can not say what love actually is. Underline the word is. One can only be love, but one can never objectify it so as to know it conceptually. In the same way, we are pure consciousness and we are pure life, and therefore we cannot objectify these to know them either, because we cannot be any other subject by which we can know this most subjective part of our nature. So essentially, love is always unmanifest. One may say, show me that you love me, but essentially that is not possible. One can express affection, which are the behavioral expressions of that subjective state of love, but love itself can never be expressed, demonstrated, or made manifest. It is, along with life and consciousness, the essential mystery. Only things which can be limited and therefore conceptualized can be known. Love and life and consciousness not being able to be limited or bounded in any way can never be conceptualized or experientially known through subject-object duality. Although we cannot talk about what love is, we can speak of the kind of relationship in which love, or our most essential self, can be released into full conscious awareness. And that relationship requires the total absorption in the other, or the full loss of self-consciousness, which means the full sacrifice of our self-concepts, because it is only our conceptual and experiential self that can be known. Because immature people are so terribly concerned with their self-concepts, because they lack the ego's basic need for a sense of identity, as well as lacking a clear sense of worth and security, the immature person is constantly self-centered and preoccupied with himself, which makes his attention flow toward himself, and therefore makes it impossible for him to lose self-consciousness totally in order to establish the ecstatic or non-dualistic love relationship. Therefore, immature people, psychologically immature people, find that there are many things in life that they cannot appreciate not because they are not available, but because the immature consciousness cannot avail itself of what is available. So that even though a love object may be available to an immature person, if one is constantly self-conscious and self-concerned, one will use that love object to fill one's feelings of deficiency and be essentially unable to give oneself totally to the other, to lose one's awareness completely in the other, and therefore the immature person will not be able to love, and thus will not be able to appreciate the sense of beauty, joy, and fulfillment that comes with a mature love relationship. Thus, the full potential for appreciating and enjoying life comes not with money or material things, but with psychological maturity. For only then can the consciousness be what it has the capacity to be. And this is quite unavailable to the immature consciousness. The relatively mature consciousness can establish an intimate and meaningful love relationship with another human being, as well as with nature, and therefore fully appreciate these forms of life. But the fully mature consciousness, the optimally mature consciousness, can go beyond even that form of love and establish an ecstatic relationship with infinite life itself, and therefore enter into transpersonal love relationship. That is to say, a love relationship between one's individuality and the source of all life, love, and consciousness. In other words, the Absolute. In the same way, as one matures, one learns how to love the representatives of pure life within oneself, which is one's feelings, that is the energy inherent in one's feelings. And so for one to really love oneself is not narcissism and is not a self-valuing, but it's a state in which one's conscious awareness in the mind enters into an ecstatic, non-dualistic relationship with one's feelings in the stomach and chest area. And in that state of union, the feelings speak for themselves and drain out. And then one is pure feeling itself, which is the transpersonal love. Paragraph indicate that the title of the book will be The Essence of Love and the Love Relationship, and that chapter 1 will deal with the mystery of love, and that section 2 will deal with the meaning of love as the ecstatic relationship. Although we cannot define or know what love essentially is, a basic definition that points to love is that the essence of all personal love, which is transpersonal love, is the uniting, actually some people may call that, of course not uniting, some people may call transpersonal love absolute love, or even divine love. And it is the uniting or union of all life forms into their one common underlying substance. Period. It is the union of infinite pure consciousness with infinite pure existence. One can come to infinite pure existence only through ecstatic love relationship with the various forms of existence. And the same is true for consciousness. One can come to infinite pure consciousness only through loving the various forms, the thoughts and feelings within consciousness. Loving meaning not to value these, to judge them as good or bad, but to enter into a state of non-dualistic union with them in terms of the substance of one's pure consciousness, entering into union with these various thought forms and feelings. Paragraph, when one enters into a love relationship, there is a sense of union in which the other person is, in a sense, incorporated into oneself. As a result, when that love relationship is terminated, it is necessary for those painful feelings related to the surrendering or giving up of that other individual within oneself, those feelings have to be faced. Many people experience this painful process almost like a nausea, a need to vomit or throw up. One becomes often physically ill as one goes through the process of surrendering a former loved one that has become embedded within ourselves. This process, which is very similar to the grief or mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, mourning reaction when one dies, involves letting these feelings rise without attempting to escape from any of them. Let them express themselves with all the hurt that is involved in them until they are fully drained. If one does not fully or completely eradicate the former love object from within the heart of one's feeling life, one is truly not free to ever really love another person. To really love another person requires giving all of yourself to the other. And if the former love object remains embedded in us, we are not free to give all of ourselves to our new loved one. Paragraph, another useful definition that I shall have to describe in more detail is that love is the essential truth, the essential condition, or the essential unity behind or prior to all subject-object knowledge, prior to the knowledge of any form or experience of the world. Unfortunately, we do not usually experience our own intrinsic loving nature, except in those rare moments when we find someone that we so deeply care about that we forget all concerns at self-consciousness and place our awareness totally upon the other. And therefore it is only at those relatively rare moments that our consciousness releases the intrinsic loving capacity that exists as the essence of our consciousness. Love is the great unifier, healer, teacher, and essential power underlying the entire universe, because it is out of the unity which love is that all truth and all creation arise. Love is mystery because it arises in us and as us only when the mind is silenced, only when there is conceptual ignorance, that is, the non-conceptualizing of ourself or of the other person. When an immature person loves, meaning values the other, the basic motivation of that kind of interaction or relationship is that the immature person is concerned essentially with his own self-enhancement. However, when a mature person loves, he is truly concerned about the well-being and the enhancement of that which is his loved one. Thus, love is always self-sacrifice, that is, the sacrifice of one's own egotistical needs in order to be totally concerned, at least for that moment, with the well-being of the other person. Thus, ego and love are antithetical to each other, opposites to each other. Love is the mind or consciousness devoid of self-consciousness. When the mind is devoid of self-consciousness, love arises. When the mind is in a state of self-consciousness, love is absent. When one is not generating concepts about oneself and thoughts about oneself, one is then pure conscious awareness, which is pure consciousness substance. It is a non-conceptually make that non-conceptualizing, a non-interpreting consciousness, a non-conceptually reacting consciousness. One is just a pure, silent witness of what is. true that love is the essential substance of the whole universe, the glue, so to speak, that holds the universe together, as well as that kind of psychological glue that holds two human beings together. Love is like the background canvas that we can't see, but